So we've just spent some time talking about institutionalization and using some examples from school. So let's dive into that a little more. Using school as an example, let's ask some questions. For example, why do people go to school? And how might we answer that using our definition of institutionalization that we have just discussed in the previous screencast, and that is discussed on page 54 in this beginning of a discussion about institutionalization. Why do people go to school? Is it a habit? If so, how did it become a habit? Is it a certain type? For example, actions of type X will be performed by actors of type X. So do people go to school because they are students? Or are people students because they go to school? A little chicken and egg scenario there. How about this? Unless you work there, if you go, what is assumed about you? That's a great question. How do we get to these assumptions? Is it because there are habitualized actions and activities? Is it because there are shared expectations? What do you expect of people who work at school? If someone is a teacher or a principal or a counselor or a cafeteria worker, are there certain expectations that you have for them because of the role that they play? And how did those roles get identified? Well, remember a couple of screencasts ago, it's through people externalizing and institutionalizing through habitualization their ideas about how they interact with one another and how they will manipulate and control their environment. Are there specialists? Are there people that we say they know this one particular bit of knowledge to the exclusion of, or maybe much more than, others? Well, we can see in the background of this picture, this is a math class. Okay? So is this a math teacher? And is he a specialist? Okay. What are the different expectations between the teacher and the students? Why do we have different expectations? How is this all part of this institutionalization idea? And what in the world does this have to do with curriculum? How did schools come into existence? Have we always had them? These are all key questions that we have to ask when we're thinking about how things become institutionalized and what that means for us when we're trying to decide about how we socially create reality and how that social construction of reality in many ways helps us explain why curriculum happens, how curriculum happens, and what it means within the education systems that we have and the world in general that we live in. Just a tiny little topic. If we look on page 55, we can see that there is a statement related to social control. They say, Berger and Lechman say, it is important to stress that this controlling character is inherent in institutionalization as such, prior to or apart from any mechanisms of sanctions specifically set up to support an institution. So there's some sort of controlling character that's inherent in institutionalization, but is separate from sanctions. So what could control what happens, what activity or behavior or expectations are related to curriculum and schooling that would be apart from sanctions, punishment? Let's read on. These mechanisms, the sum of which constitute what is generally called a system of social control, do of course exist in many institutions and in all the agglomerations of institutions that we call societies. In other words, there are controls that exist within larger groups like society, as well as smaller institutions and organizations, that control what happens without exhibiting any particular sanction mechanism. Their controlling efficacy, however, is of a secondary or supplementary kind. As we shall see later, the primary social control is given in the existence of an institution as such. To say that a segment of human activity has been institutionalized is already to say that this segment of human activity has been subsumed under social control. Additional control mechanisms are required only insofar as the processes of institutionalization are less than completely successful. Well, what does this mean? That's a good question. Let's think of it like this. Let's say that we could visualize, let's just imagine with me, we're visualizing society. This is society, this is the Lehigh community, all right? And this green line visually represents the boundaries of that community. Those could be physical boundaries, in other words, the campus. Those could be community boundaries. That would be the students, the faculty, the staff, the alums, wherever they are. It doesn't have a physical location. It's more of a relationship boundary. This could be the imagined community that we talked about on the first day from Benedict Anderson, where there are associations and horizontal comradeship that goes on among all of those that we imagine are part of our community. Whatever boundaries we're talking about, we can visualize them here. And let's say that there's a certain set of shared expectations that go along with participation in that community. Shared expectations about activity and actors, right? Just like we talked about. When we were, see if I can get back there. Actions of type X will be performed by actors of type X. So, actors or actions of type X will be performed by actions of type X. So, actions of whatever type will be performed by members of the Lehigh University community. Now, what kind of activities would we expect within that community and outside of that community? Are there any things we wouldn't expect a Lehigh University community member to do? Well, let's go just all the way to the end, crazy, example, and say murder, right? We would not expect a member of the Lehigh community to commit murder, right? So within this boundary, there are all sorts of activities that are normal. And I'm using air quotes here. Shared expectations about what is normal for Lehigh community members. Outside of that community, let me see if I can get a different color pen here to help set this apart a little bit. Ooh, let's do red. So here's our boundary, right? But outside of that community, we have something as horrible and heinous as murder. We would never expect this to be in here. Never. Does that mean that it doesn't exist in there sometimes? Unfortunately, probably not. Does it mean that it's right or wrong for it to exist inside here or outside here? Like, is it wrong in here but right out here? Of course not. It's wrong everywhere you go. Right? So what makes the difference then? Why are there some sort of sanctions against something crazy like this that would be extra something within the Lehigh community? That's kind of what we're talking about here. All right. So what does this mean? Well, one means, let me erase the ink so we can read that. Pointer options, there we go, erase all the ink. Institutions have social controls, but they are by definition social controls. Okay, so institutions themselves, let's talk about the institution of, I'm going to make this an E instead of an S. Education. It's a worldwide institution, but let's say that there are still boundaries to what it can do that are visually represented by this line I keep drawing. All right? So institutions themselves have social controls, some sort of expectations that that control character without imposing specific mechanisms of sanctions. Right? But we understand that this boundary then is itself a social control. Right? So we haven't used this word very much yet. Rationalized boundary. So we can say that there are rationalized boundaries that set the limits on where particular institutions have a right to expect or can expect particular activities or actions or behaviors, and that it is limited by these boundaries. We don't expect people who aren't part of a formal education system to come to school every day. In fact, we frown on it if they do. If I, as a 44-year-old guy, just showed up at a third grade classroom, people would think I was weird. That may already be true, but the point is, it's outside of this limited rationalized boundary. It's way outside. So this limits what is expected. And we tend to share expectations about what belongs inside here. So how do institutions form? Institutions like education. Well, on pages 55 and 56, Berger and Leckman say, in actual experience, institutions generally manifest themselves in collectivities containing considerable numbers of people. All right. It is theoretically important, however, to emphasize that the institutionalizing process of reciprocal typification would occur even if two individuals began to interact de novo. Institutionalization is incipient in every social situation continuing in time. That's kind of a interesting word to use. Let me get my pointer back. I don't know what happened to that. Incipient, huh? Let us assume that two persons from entirely different social worlds begin to interact. By saying persons, we presuppose that the two individuals have formed selves, something that could, of course, have occurred only in a social process. All right? So we know a couple of things about institutions. One is that they're collectivities containing a lot of people. Okay? It's certainly possible to, they're saying, see an institutionalizing process that occurs in, two individuals from the start or afresh. They're also saying that institutionalization is a part of every social situation continuing in time. So it's not this abstract or outlying phenomenon. It's something that goes on really any time there are collectivities containing considerable numbers of people. And then they go on to say, as A and B interact in whatever manner, typifications will be produced quite quickly. A watches B perform. He attributes motives to B's actions and sees the actions recur, typifies the motives as recurrent. As B goes on performing, A is soon able to say to himself, aha, there he goes again. But at the same time, A may assume that B is doing the same thing with regard to him. This is that reciprocal typification. From the beginning, both A and B assume this reciprocity of typification. In the course of their interaction, these typifications will be expressed in specific patterns of conduct. That is, A and B will begin to play roles vis-a-vis each other. This will occur even if each continues to perform actions different from those of the other. The possibility of taking the role of the other will appear with regard to the same actions performed by both. That is, one will inwardly appropriate the other's reiterated roles and make them the models for his own role playing. All right? So this is showing how we play off of each other and we play off of groups to create this reciprocal typification. But it moves from there he goes again to there it is one more time, or yes, I'm used to this, or I've seen this before. It becomes habitualized. Right? So they say, while this reciprocal typification is not yet institutionalization, since there are only only being two individuals, there's no possibility of a typology of actors, it is clear that institutionalization is already present in nucleo. We will move on to this in the next video.